Welcome back. You're watching the 2012 Africa Dialogue series here in Sun City, where we are discussing how to integrate Africa's economies and ensure also, of course, the continent gets maximum advantage out of South Africa's membership of the BRICS nations. Before we took the break, there were a number of issues that arose out of that discussion. We kicked off by having Minister Rob Davies pick up from where he left off in the first half.
Well, I think that is the nub of the question, because if you look at, for example, South Africa's trade with China, the top 10 products, our exports to China, they start with iron ore and then go through 9 other unprocessed mineral products. Our imports start with cell phones and go through a number of other value-added products. So it is that nature of that trade that is important. Having said that, I think that there are some important developments taking place, among others, in China itself, which I think can create conditions for us to begin to make some changes in that pattern. Among other things, China is conscious of those imbalances and is prepared to work with some of us around that question. For example, last year, we as South Africa gave them a list of 10 value-added products we believe we could supply, and we ran trade missions focusing on those products, and we actually succeeded in gaining some orders. But I think more importantly, the Chinese economy is undergoing a period now where its growth of the internal market and internal consumption is important. So China is actually one of the few countries in the world that's now beginning to define an import policy as well as an export policy. So I think that we're in a good moment. But as I said in an earlier panel, I think that the question of adding value to the raw materials that we export is a common challenge that faces many of us. We have one project in South Africa, I can just give the figures very quickly, which is well past feasibility and is a private sector driven project. It would turn mineral sands into products like titanium and zirconium. What we get for exporting the mineral sands is $440 a ton. What we get for exporting titanium alloy, which is the envisaged product, is well over $100,000 a ton. So that is value which at the moment is going to somebody else's economy, but which could find its presence in the South African economy. And I think there must be millions of examples dotted across the African continent. I think that what is required in a number of cases is that we negotiate. We negotiate, we say, right, we will supply you, but we would expect investments in this or that or the other beneficiation project in return. And I think that we would do much better in that if we were united as a continent, or at least as a regional blocks in those kinds of negotiations. So I do think that this is ultimately the question that lies ahead. And then the other thing linked to that is that we are all industrializing countries, or at least have an ambition to be industrializing countries. And I think this means that we have areas where we're head-on competitive, where I think zero-sum is the name of the game. But we also have other areas where we are complementary, where we are focusing on particular aspects of production in particular value chains. And I think the challenge is for us to try to identify those complementarities and build trade relations around those. Those are, I think, are the challenges on the trade front, to try to overcome, I think, what sometimes we have called in these discussions the structural imbalance in our trade relation.
Thank you, Minister. I guess the challenge of beneficiation is one that's going to be with us for a long time, but certainly I think the buck stops right with the ministers, because they are the ones who make policy and make it possible, and also demand that those who come and invest and take out our resources are responsible for putting up factories and other things that give us more value on those. Minister Pule, you also had an addition you wanted to add. How do we maximize the advantages that we have? Because we certainly know there are drawbacks, there are advantages, but how do we make the most of the advantages that we have?
Firstly, I think that if we invest in infrastructure, we will be able to reduce the cost to communicate, that's one. And two, I think that we can then take advantage of R&D, the area of research and development, and make sure that both as a government in Africa, and in particular in South Africa, and companies, business, were able to partner and make sure that we work hard on R&D. Two, on innovation. if we can try and work hard and learn from knowledge sharing from our partners and make sure that we begin to come up with innovation so that we can also trade from our country and also from Africa. One of the panelists here spoke about the manufacturing of electronics. For an example, the handheld phones. That today you have them at a lower price, even if it's a smartphone, which is at a lower price, but they're not made in South Africa. So we are calling upon South Africans, business people, to be able to try and learn on innovation and make sure that we manufacture these gadgets from the country and from Africa so that we can then try and reduce the cost to communicate. But also it will help in that once we produce them in Africa and in our country, accessing data is going to be even more easier, and especially because in our country we are mostly rural, and I know that studies are showing that fixed lines are very limited in rural areas. What we find is that many people in rural areas have mobile phones, and I think that many of those rural people don't have jobs. So they don't even have money to buy these cell phones. So it's quite very important that South African companies and African companies, and including governments, we must then begin to invest in R&D. We must also invest in manufacturing of electronics so that cost to communicate can then come down.
I think the minister has certainly thrown the challenge back at business. The policy and regulatory frameworks are being reformed, so business is able to take advantages of the opportunities that we have. At this stage, we'd like to open the discussion to questions from the floor. There are roving mics around the room. If you can raise up your hand, it will certainly come to you. While we're waiting for the hands to come up and for the mics to be identified, I think it's important to realize that while we speak about the other parts of the BRICS, we're speaking about one country, whereas in Africa we're talking 54 countries. So for them, it's easier for them to coordinate policy, whereas in Africa we have to coordinate through these 54 different governments across the continent, and therein lies the challenge. And again, come back and lay the challenge squarely back at our politicians here at the table today. How do we make the political systems work to such an extent that we speak as one voice? And when we go and we pronounce, say for instance, there is a trade dispute between South Africa and Brazil, and I'm just mentioning those two as an example, I'm not talking about the chickens. How do we make that issue relevant for the other African countries? Minister Davis, I'm sure that is at your door. The chickens.
On chickens. Well, I think that there's more press hullabaloo than there really is a real issue. The Brazilians are not about to take us to the WTO. We have a discussion with them about a number of TBTs. We in fact are trying to trade two off. One is about wine access into Mercosur, and the other one is about pork meat into South Africa. We've coined a little phrase there, we call it wine for swine, and I think that we are engaging around these and other matters quite productively. There's no big crisis around that.
If I can just add, as long as it's not talking about swine wine, then it's okay. Maybe that's a product. Much of what we're talking about is, if you like, hard infrastructure. Whether it's R&D, whether it's the logistics network or the financial network. If we to meet Godfrey's challenge, we also need a soft infrastructure. And by that I mean is a recognition amongst the critical mass of African leaders, both political and business and civil society, that we have a huge opportunity to leapfrog developmentally. But we will only leapfrog if we get our ducks in a row. And if we are able to develop the right kind of synergies and approaches, both amongst ourselves and to the rest of the world. The second is a recognition that collaboration is indispensable to African success. If we think that all of us are going to shoot the other down and get better access to a particular market by undermining each other, then we really are wasting a huge historical opportunity. So how do we build both a competitive mindset amongst ourselves, but also more importantly, a collaborative mindset? One of the serious challenges, for example, in developing regional logistics is getting 5 or 6 or 10 countries to agree on the legal framework and the conditionalities to build a road through each of those countries or a railroad. And a lot of our time is spent negotiating those issues rather than very speedily getting implementation done around some of those things. So collaboration is going to be fundamental to capitalizing on the opportunities that we have. The third picks up on something my colleagues have been talking about, and that is that the relationship, and I think President Zuma mentioned it in his remarks, between ourselves and the other BRICS countries can't be one-way trade. There must be a commitment to reciprocity. In other words, we give opportunities to other BRICS countries on the African continent. African countries and companies should be given opportunities in BRICS countries as well. And building different lines of reciprocity is going to be absolutely critical. The last is again a challenge for leadership on the continent. If we become victims of just short-term thinking, which is what does my balance sheet look like or the profit numbers look like per quarter or per half the year, then we'll be selling ourselves short as well. We need a fine balance between short-term concrete achievements and a long-term commitment to sustainable development on the continent, in every sense of that word. When we're building a railroad, we're not building it for the next year. We're building it for the next 30 years. When we're putting in digital infrastructure, again, this is for future generations. And so how we balance short-term investment and short-term profit derivation, if you like, with a longer-term perspective and longer-term plans, despite the fact that political cycles work in 5 years, is going to be a huge challenge. In a recent meeting of African ministers of finance and others in Addis Ababa, this is just about 2 weeks ago, one of the complaints that we've made about ourselves on this continent is that every time an administration changes through elections, old policies go out and new policies take 2 years to develop. Now, you don't require that rate of replacement just because we are new as a government in office. And so a different kind of political culture as part of the soft infrastructure is going to be required if we're going to capitalize on the opportunities that we have.
Thank you, Minister Gordon. You spoke about the opportunity that we have to leapfrog our development as a continent. And obviously with most opportunities, as we know in the private sector, there's a time frame attached to that. And it's key to act within a certain time frame. And in the BRICS context, there's a lot of discussion currently about the expansion of BRICS to include other countries, such as the like of Turkey. What do we think the implication would be for South Africa of something like that? Simon, if we can start maybe with you.
Sure. So I mentioned earlier that we started writing a BRIC Africa Monthly. In fact, 2 months ago, we changed that to an EM10 Africa Monthly. We did that because there are other emerging markets that are becoming increasingly fundamental for Africa. They represent this shift towards a multipolar world, and our trade with them is often much larger than it is with some of the BRICS, particularly Russia. So you take, Anusha, the example of Turkey. Last year, Turkey-Africa trade was around $17 or $18 billion compared to trade with Russia of around $7 billion. So Turkey, in many ways, given their growth trajectory, given the demand that they have for African exports and the synergies which exist between their firms in the construction and engineering space, we know that the Prime Minister paid a visit to South Africa last year. So there are other markets that we think are fundamentally important. Saudi Arabia, very much around the food equation, rising per capita food consumption, an acute demand for agricultural production outside of Saudi Arabia, and Africa really provides a lot of that opportunity. There's tremendous threats there, and we need to balance those very carefully. And others such as Indonesia and Thailand, for us, are increasingly important. When you mention, Anusha, the question about what it means for South Africa, we've included in that EM10, and we've done that because of all of the economies in the world, certainly on the continent, South Africa has become increasingly connected to Africa's growth story. So there's a lot of negative news flow around South Africa's missing out. We're missing the boat when it comes to the rest of Africa, and I would contest that. I think if you look at our trade profile, last year we ran a 46 billion rand trade surplus with SADC, and that's not including Namibia and Botswana, compared to a deficit with most other nations. of all intra-African manufactured goods, so all manufactured goods that are made in Africa and traded within Africa, half of them are made by a South African firm. So I think these types of synergies from SA Inc. Going north into the rest of the continent really show that South Africa is extremely well positioned to benefit from Africa's growth. And we also included Nigeria, and I think for similar reasons linked around West African regional integration and some of the synergies which exist there. So I'm positive not just around BRICS, but around the whole emerging markets adjustment. And I think the EM10 in some way capture that. And I think South Africa, linking to Minister Gordhan's point about reciprocity, if we can ensure that our firms have more fluid access into these markets, we really will be extremely well positioned.
The small size of the South African market is a factor, which is why I think we've been constantly arguing that the industrialization of the African continent, including the further industrialization of South Africa, does require that we move forward in regional integration. I think also just the point that was made earlier about South African exports into the rest of the continent, value-added products, that is true, but I think that to sustain that and to be able to move forward with that, we're going to have to create an equitable and mutually beneficial pattern of trade so that we don't just replicate an imbalanced trade with the rest of the African continent. Then the question of do we have identified areas and things of that sort. I think that within manufacturing, within services, I think we have clearly identifiable strengths. I think the things like there are agro-processing products, I mean, for example, wine, and other fruit products and stuff like that. We have a definite competitive advantage there. We have a serious, I think, competitive advantage in a number of infrastructure projects, which is reflected in the fact that AXA is involved in the reconstruction of the Mumbai airport, but also one of the airports in Sao Paulo for the World Cup. Also, we have mining technology, we have strengths in different engineering projects, products and so on, and then in financial services, insurance and stuff of that sort. So I think that we have a mixture of strengths that we have. And I think that obviously it's our intention as we further industrialize it, we expand those strengths. And that we build on those strengths as we trade with other BRICS countries. Because, I mean, just to repeat the point I was making earlier on, I think that our future, and this is not just the South African story, but the future of the African continent does not lie in trading with the BRICS as suppliers of dirt out of the ground to support their industrialization. We've also got to capture that industrialization, or at least a part of it, for ourselves and our own economies.
Minister, thank you very much. Minister Pule, you want to add something quickly? We're running out of time. Thank you.
Thank you. On the license issue, how is it possible that we can give the two different licenses to one person? I think that ICASA is our regulator, has been following what the policy directives has been. And I must say that it has been a long time now, as we sit here, that we have never been able to review the policies that we have in communications. And I'm actually excited to say to you, next week, from the 19th and the 20th, we have a conference back in Johannesburg where we are going to do an overhaul review of the policies of ICT or communications in the country, so that we can then look at some of these issues that we have raised today. And I think that it will be quite important if you were to participate, so that you can also contribute in terms of us shaping or reshaping our policies going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Pule. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions now. So we're just going to ask for closing comments. If we can start with Andrew down on the side there. Andrew, do you have some closing comments for us? And then if Ian, if you could just follow up there.
Yeah, very quickly for me, I just believe that we need to have an integrated infrastructure development approach. I think gone are the days when we look at a road, a rail, we look at them as separate projects. I think if we're going to accelerate our development, we have to adopt an integrated approach where when we build a road, next to that road we build a railway line as well as the broadband that is required. Thank you.
Thank you. I think my closing remark would be that BRICS is a tremendous opportunity for South Africa and Africa, but it's an opportunity that will not come to us. We have to go into BRICS. We have to search out those opportunities to find business ventures to benefit our operations and our minerals. If we do that, if more Africans and South Africans participate in the debate around BRICS, participate in the discussion groups around BRICS, we will find those opportunities. And so I think this is a tremendous time to be in Africa, to be part of the growth and the development of the continent, but I think we have to do it. No one was going to do it for us.
Thank you, Minister Davies.
Well, I think the way the world is shaping up and reshaping, the growth story is, first of all, in some of the BRICS in Asia, then Africa is next, and then there's another bunch of other countries in ASEAN, in Turkey, in the Gulf, and so on, which I think are all part of the equation. I think the fact that we enjoy excellent political relations with those countries, we have a shared vision about growth, development, industrialization, is something that is an enormous asset to us as a country in South Africa, but also as a representative in the BRICS of the African continent. So I think that there is a work program which is only just beginning. I think there's some very exciting prospects, and I think that it's very important that we work together energetically to realize the huge potential opportunity that we have.
I just want to call upon business to partner with government on our road to try and make sure that communications is accessible to the people of South Africa and the continent. And I think that what is important is for all of us to partner in connecting Africa for the future.
Just 2 points. In addition to the leapfrogging point as an African opportunity, I think we need more conversations like the one we're having today, although it's a bit one-sided, about what is Africa's growth story and how do we give it coherence and find a place for all 54 countries within that growth story. The second contribution that Africa can make to humanity is to redefine economic growth models so that the growth in Africa creates more equality, not more inequality, where the growth in Africa creates greater inclusion of people rather than excluding people. And the growth in Africa results in shared benefits to the 1 billion people and not just a small elite. And that will be part of our challenge as well.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I've emphasized the positive aspects, of which there are many, with BRICS alignment. And I think we also need to be cautious. Minister Davies mentioned the need to create mutually beneficial and equitable trade. I think the industrialization and beneficiation processes are crucial. And I think that BRIC countries increasingly are going to be more competitors than collaborators in unlocking a lot of the opportunities within South Africa and within the rest of the continent. And perhaps finally, just on Minister Godin's point as well, a few weeks ago we were at a summit talking about BRICS, and there was a delegation from Oxfam which spoke about how within the BRICS countries, it's half of the world's poor people, it's around 40% of the world's disease burden is held within these countries, a tremendous amount of learnings that we can share amongst the BRICS countries around how to develop our countries, how to alleviate poverty and lower that income gap, which is increasing in virtually all BRIC countries. And I think there's a lot that South Africa can learn from that.
Thank you, Honourable Ministers and gentlemen. In 2013, South Africa is going to host the next BRICS summit, and we truly hope that this BRICS relationship would mean that we'd progress against the challenges that Honourable Minister Godin talked about, shared, sustained economic growth for all the people on this continent, which is what we would hope for and which we hope that our relationship and our participation in BRICS will bring for us. Godfrey?
Thank you, Anusha. I think if I were to summarize all the wise words that have been coming out of everybody here, there's one consistent message that is coming out, and it is that we must take advantage. There's willingness on both governments as well as our business leaders to ensure that this works. Thank you all very much for watching us and watching this debate. I've been given the task of announcing the next 2 sessions, and they are Powering Africa's Growth, the opportunities and the challenges, and I'm sure there are certainly many of them, and we can debate and find solutions for them. There's another session on beneficiation, a subject that we also touched during this session, and that's going to be about moving up the whole value chain. How do we add value to our resources and raw materials? Thank you all for your time, and good evening. You've been watching a special edition of the 2012 Africa Dialogue Series here in Sun City in the Platinum Province of South Africa in the Northwest, where we've got African government leaders and business leaders discussing and agreeing almost most of the time to the need to try and ensure that Africa gets maximum advantage out of the resources boom that we have seen, and that we ensure that we beneficiate, we add value to the resources that we are producing in Africa, and ensure that that fuels growth for the African continent going into the next millennium. I'm Godfrey Mochizwa. Goodbye.